He had been riding for 3 days, going east, going away. He had no reason to stop.
A child crying, high and thin, almost gone. He told himself it wasn't his concern.
He turned the horse around. He told himself it was just a direction, not a decision.
The snow came without warning. 1 hour the sky was the color of dirty wool, low and pressing down on the Wyoming hills like a hand trying to smother something. The next hour there was nothing, no sky, no hills, no horizon. Just white, moving sideways, cutting through every layer of clothing like the cold had a personal grievance against the living. Elias Cord pulled his collar up and urged his mare forward. Dust, he called her. A gray horse with a white blaze and the disposition of someone who had seen too much and chosen patience over complaint. She moved through the knee-deep drifts without being asked twice, though she tossed her head every few minutes to shake the ice from her lashes. Elias understood the impulse. 3 days he had been riding through this. 3 days of frozen creeks and dead campfires, and the silence that only comes when the world has been buried alive. He was moving east, roughly. That was all he knew. East toward something, away from everything else. He did not let himself think about what he was moving away from. The trick he had learned was to keep his mind on small things, the weight of his saddlebags, the rhythm of Dust's breathing, the way ice formed along the brim of his hat and had to be knocked off every mile or so. Small things, manageable things, things that did not have faces. He had been doing this for 3 years. Before Wyoming there had been Colorado. Before Colorado, Kansas. Before Kansas, a life that felt like it had happened to someone else entirely. A house with yellow curtains, a practice with his name on the door, a daughter who used to steal his stethoscope and press it to her doll's chest, announcing gravely that the patient would survive. Eleanor, her name was. 7 years old when the fever took her. He stopped that thought the same way he always did. Not by pushing it down, which never worked, but by focusing on something immediate and physical. The cold in his fingers, the creak of the saddle leather. The fact that Dust had slowed without being asked and was lifting her head, ears pricked towards something on the wind. Elias reined her to a stop. He listened. The blizzard howled. Branches cracked somewhere in the white dark to his left. The wind picked up, and then dropped, and then picked up again. He waited through 2 cycles of it, patient and still, the way his own father had taught him to listen for things that didn't want to be heard. There, high and thin and almost swallowed entirely by the storm, a child crying. Elias sat with it for a moment. He was aware of what was happening inside his chest, the old pull, the instinct that had been ground into him through 4 years of medical school and 12 years of practice. Something in distress moved toward it. He was also aware of what he had decided 3 years ago, standing at the edge of 2 graves in the frozen ground outside Larimer County. He had decided that he was done with the weight of other people's survival, done with the cruelty of caring and failing. He had been a good doctor, the best in the county, people had said, and they had meant it kindly. It had not saved Eleanor. It had not saved Margaret, who followed her daughter into death 8 days later, as if she had simply decided she did not want to stay in a world without her. The crying continued. He turned Dust toward it. He told himself it was not a decision, it was just a direction. The wagon was at the bottom of a shallow ravine, resting on its side like an animal that had given up trying to stand. One of the horses was dead in the traces, its neck bent at an angle that told the whole story in a single image. The other horse was gone. The snow around the wagon had been churned up hours ago and was now smoothing itself back over, the blizzard doing its patient work of erasure. 3 people lay in the open ground beside the wreckage. A man, a woman, a boy who could not have been older than 12. All of them shot. Elias dismounted slowly, his right hand moving to the colt at his hip without conscious thought. He swept the ravine in sections the way the army surgeon who had trained him had taught, moving his eyes in a grid rather than letting them go to the most dramatic thing first. No movement, no tracks leading away that were less than 4 hours old. Whoever had done this was gone. The storm had seen to that. He holstered the gun. The crying was coming from behind the overturned wagon. He moved around the broken rear axle and stopped. 2 children. A girl, 10 years old he guessed, with brown hair matted with blood that was not her own. She had positioned herself against the shattered wheel with her back to the wind and her arms wrapped around a smaller boy, 8 or so, who was pressed against her chest. The boy's mouth was open, his face was streaming with tears, but no sound was coming from him. The crying Elias had heard was hers, and it stopped the moment she saw him. She looked up with eyes that had already finished being surprised by the worst things. "I heard you coming for the last quarter mile," she said. Her voice was flat and steady. "You ride heavy for a man traveling alone." Elias crouched down, moving slowly, keeping himself at their level. "I'm not going to hurt you. You understand that? I'm not one of them." The girl studied him with the thoroughness of someone who had recently learned that first impressions could be fatal. That's what the last stranger said, before he rode past without stopping. There was no accusation in it, just information. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Ada Marsh. This is my brother Owen." She looked down at the boy. "He can't talk, not since they shot Mama and Papa." Elias looked at Owen. The boy's eyes were open and tracking but fixed on something that wasn't in the ravine. Dissociation, the medical part of his mind said, the part that never fully went quiet no matter how hard he tried. Acute traumatic shock, possibly deeper. How many were there? He asked Ada. 4 that I saw. Maybe a 5th holding the horses back on the road. She said it the way someone would report the weather. They took everything. Money, food, the good rifle. Shot William first because he tried to fight. He was 12. She did not look at the body of the boy in the snow, then Mom and Papa. Why didn't they? We hid under the wagon, Owen and me. Her arms tightened slightly around her brother. We didn't make any sound. Elias held her gaze for a moment. He thought about what it cost a child to hold still and silent while the world ended 12 feet away. He did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. I need to get you warm, he said. Both of you. Can you walk? Owen can if I help him. Then let's go. She looked at him for one more moment, conducting some final internal calculation. Then she reached out and took his extended hand. Her grip was stronger than he expected. He got them back to dust, settled Owen in front of him against his chest, and put Ada behind with her arms around his waist. The boy was ice cold through his coat and did not react to being lifted or placed. Ada positioned herself without instruction and without complaint. As they moved off along the ridge, Elias felt her forehead come to rest briefly against his back, just once, and then she straightened again. He pretended not to notice. They had been riding for less than an hour when dust stopped on her own. Elias had learned to trust this. The mare had better instincts than most people he'd known, and she was pointing her nose toward a gap in the tree line to the south with the focused attention of something that had decided to make a point. He saw the second wagon through the gap. This one was upright, which meant it had not been thrown but had simply stopped. The horses stood with their heads down, still in the traces, which meant they were alive but done. No movement from the canvas cover. Snow had drifted against the left wheel undisturbed. Stay here, Elias told Ada. How long? Until I come back. He dismounted and approached on foot, one hand on the colt, moving toward the wagon at an angle that kept him clear of the blind spot behind the canvas. He called out twice. No response. He climbed the wheel and pulled the canvas back. Inside, a woman curled on her side. A girl pressed against her spine. A small boy tangled in a quilt at her feet. In the far corner, wedged between a trunk and the wagon wall, a smaller figure wrapped in a torn horse blanket. The woman first. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, a pulse, thin and fast and irregular, but there. Her eyes opened. Brown, filmed with fever, not entirely focused. Daniel, she said. No, ma'am. My name is Elias. I'm going to help you. Her hand came up and found his wrist with a grip that had nothing to do with how weak the rest of her seemed. My children. Tell me my children. He checked the girl and the boy beside her, both breathing, shallow but present. The girl was shivering hard. The boy had gone still in the way of small children who have used up all their available warmth. Breathing, he said. All of them. But we need to move. There's another one. The woman's grip tightened. In the back, Wren. She was sleeping when it happened. He was already moving. He pushed through the jumbled supplies to the far corner and pulled back the horse blanket. A child, 4 years old perhaps, small even for that. Dark circles under closed eyes, lips the color of dried lavender, skin cold to the touch. He pressed his fingers to her throat. Alive, but barely. He touched her cheek gently to see if she would rouse. Her eyes flew open. She did not scream. She did something worse. She went completely rigid, every muscle locked, eyes wide and fixed on Elias with an expression of pure animal terror, and she made no sound at all. Not a cry, not a word, nothing. Just that locked stillness, like something that had learned that making noise brought worse things down on you. Elias pulled his hand back immediately and moved away from her, giving her the space she needed. Wren, the woman called from the front of the wagon. Her voice was strained with effort. Wren! It's all right. It's safe. The child did not move, did not speak. Elias had seen this before, in soldiers after battles that had gone very wrong, that shutdown where the mind pulls every available resource inward and posts nothing at the perimeter but instinct. He did not try to approach her again. He went back to the woman. What's your name? He asked. Nora Voss. She was trying to sit up and failing. My husband. I saw. Her jaw tightened. She accepted this the way someone accepts news they already knew was coming. How bad am I? Elias looked at her honestly. Fever, dehydration, exposure, and 7 months pregnant, though the pregnancy itself seemed stable as far as he could tell without a proper examination. Bad enough that we can't stay here. There's a cabin, Nora said. 3 miles north. Abandoned mine operation. Daniel and I passed it coming out. Stone foundation should still be standing. Can you tell me how to find it? Follow the creek north. It runs along a ridge. You'll see the chimney. Her eyes were closing with the effort of staying conscious. Promise me something. Mrs. Voss, if I don't make it, her hand found his again. Promise me my children don't end up alone. Elias looked at her. He had not made a promise he meant in 3 years. He had not wanted to because promises required a belief in your own continued ability to act, and he had not been sure of that. You're going to make it, he said roughly, because those children need you, so don't give me an easy out. Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something more durable than a smile. He climbed back out of the wagon. Ada was exactly where he had left her. Owen was exactly as he had been, eyes open and elsewhere. Ada looked at Elias with that unnervingly adult assessment. There's more of them, she said. It was not a question. A woman, 3 children. One of them is very young and very frightened. Think you can help with that? Ada looked at him steadily. What do you need me to do? He climbed into the wagon and positioned himself near Wren, staying low, keeping his distance. Just sit near her. Don't touch her. Don't talk directly at her. Just be there. Ada moved into the wagon without hesitation and settled herself on the floor a few feet from Wren, drawing her knees up, making herself small. She did not speak. She did not look at the child directly. She simply existed nearby. Owen, still cradled against Elias's side, lifted his head for the first time. He looked at Wren. Wren looked at Owen. Whatever passed between them, Elias could not have named it. But Owen slid out of Elias's grip and moved across the wagon floor until he was sitting next to Ada, within arm's reach of the small girl in the corner. He did not touch her. He did not make a sound. He simply settled there, patient and still, 2 broken things existing in proximity. Wren's breathing changed. The locked rigidity softened, not much, but enough. She drew her knees in and leaned, almost imperceptibly, in Owen's direction. Elias watched this for a moment, then he turned away before the feeling in his chest could find a name. It took 2 hours to get them all to the cabin. He rode ahead once to confirm it was standing and could be secured, left Ada in charge of the wounded and the young, and came back to help Nora into the saddle for the final stretch. She made no complaint about any of it. She was the kind of woman he was beginning to understand who saved her complaints for things that actually warranted them. The cabin was small, 15 feet by 20, stone floor, log walls that had dried and hardened over years of abandonment. The roof was intact. There was wood stacked in the far corner, old but dry, protected from the weather by the overhang. A stone fireplace with a flue that still drew. Elias got the fire going in under 10 minutes. He had always been good with fires. Margaret had teased him about it once, calling it his most useful talent, better than medicines. He did not let himself stay in that memory. He laid Nora near the fire on the cleanest surface he could arrange. She was running a temperature he could feel through the back of his hand pressed to her forehead. Too high. Her pulse was faster than he liked, and her breathing had a shallow, rapid quality that spoke of a body working very hard to maintain basic functions. He needed to examine her properly. He reached for his saddlebag and stopped with his hand on the clasp. The medical bag was inside. He had not opened it since Larimer County. He had carried it for 3 years out of some habit he could not explain, or maybe out of a stubbornness he did not want to examine too closely, but he had not opened it. He had not used the instruments. He had not let himself be what he had been trained to be. That's yours. He looked up. Ada was standing 2 feet away, looking at the bag. She must have been watching him for a while. He had not heard her move. What? The bag? The initials on it are EC. She met his eyes. You're a doctor. I was. What changed? He didn't answer. Ada crouched down so she was at eye level with the bag. She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt deliberate. Then she said, without looking at him, my papa fixed watches. He said the worst thing a craftsman could do was put down his tools because a job went wrong once. She looked up. He didn't mean tools. Elias looked at her. You don't get to let her die, Ada said, because you're afraid of what it means if you fail again. That's not her problem. That's yours. It was the most precise thing anyone had said to him in 3 years. He looked at the bag for another moment. Then he opened it. The instruments were there in their velvet-lined places. Stethoscope, scalpel, forceps, suture kit, the small glass bottles of carbolic solution he replenished whenever he passed through a town with a proper apothecary. He had told himself he kept them for emergencies. He had never acknowledged what an emergency would have to look like before he would use them. He knew what it had to look like now. He placed the stethoscope against Nora's chest. Her heartbeat filled his ears, faster than normal, slightly arrhythmic, the signature of a body under fever stress. He moved the instrument down to her swollen abdomen and listened. There, under the maternal heartbeat. Smaller, quicker, steady the baby. He closed his eyes for 1 second and felt something he had not felt in 3 years pass through him without him being able to stop it. Then he opened his eyes and went to work. He cleaned the surface wounds on her hands and temple, assessed the fever as high but not yet in the dangerous range, and confirmed that the pregnancy showed no signs of immediate complication beyond the stress the rest of her body was under. He covered her in every blanket the combined wagons had produced and moved her as close to the fire as was safe. The children had arranged themselves without being told. Ada sat nearest the fire, her body angled to shield Owen, who sat next to Wren. Cecily, the 7-year-old, had positioned herself with her back to the log wall and her brother Holt's head in her lap. She was stroking his hair with a methodical patience that suggested this was something she had done many times in recent weeks. Holt was asleep, his face still puffy with recent crying but peaceful. June, the child Elias had not yet explained to any of them, sat in the far corner awake but not looking at anything. Elias moved through the children quietly, confirming what he already suspected. Dehydration in most of them. Mild frostbite in the extremities that would need watching. Holt had a shallow cut on his forearm that had stopped bleeding on its own. Cecily had bruised ribs she had not mentioned. He noticed the way she held herself and understood without asking. He noted it and moved on. Ada watched him work through all of this without commenting. When he came back to the fire and sat down, she handed him a tin cup of water she had gotten from the melted snow pot without being asked. He drank it and set the cup down. You did that before, she said. Checked people. It was different from how you moved earlier. Before you opened the bag. After you opened it, you moved differently, like you remembered where your hands were supposed to go. Elias looked at the fire. I had a daughter, he said. The words came out the way things come out when they have been held under pressure for too long, not gently. Her name was Eleanor. She was 7. He stopped. Scarlet fever. 3 years ago. Ada was quiet. My wife followed her 8 days later. I don't know if it was the fever or if she just decided. He turned the tin cup in his hands. I was there for both of them. I did everything I knew how to do. Everything the books said. Everything my training told me. He stopped again. It didn't matter. The fire crackled and sent a wave of heat over both of them. Outside, the blizzard had picked up again, throwing itself against the stone walls with a sound like running water. So you quit, Ada said. Not unkindly. I stopped being a doctor, yes, but you still carried the bag. He had no answer for that. Ada looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, when they shot William, I wanted to run out from under the wagon. I wanted to so badly it hurt, like something was trying to pull me out from the inside. She folded her hands in her lap. I didn't, because Owen needed me to stay still. But it wasn't bravery. It was just having something more important than what I wanted. She looked at him. Maybe that's what the bag was, she said. Something more important that you weren't ready to admit to yet. Elias did not respond for a long time. Across the cabin, Owen had fallen asleep with his shoulder touching Wren's. The small girl had not moved away. She was awake, watching the fire, but the locked terror had eased into something more like exhausted vigilance. Not safe, not yet, but no longer the edge of a cliff. He got up and checked Nora again. Her fever was still present, but the rhythm of her heartbeat had stabilized. Her hands were warm now against the back of his. The color had returned to her lips. He was sitting back when her eyes opened. Not the unfocused opening of earlier. Clear present. She was looking at him and she knew who she was looking at. Water, she said. He held the cup for her. She drank slowly, 3 small swallows, then turned her head to scan the cabin. He watched her count the children. He watched her reach 7 and register what that number meant. All of them, she said quietly. All of them. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Her hand moved to her stomach, resting there with the instinctive protectiveness he had seen in every pregnant woman he had ever treated. This one, too. This one especially. Your name is Elias, she said. Yes. Are you a doctor? He looked at her. He thought about the 3 years of saying no. He thought about the bag, opened now, the instruments out, carbolic on his hands. Yes, he said, and it was the first time he had said it in 3 years and meant it without flinching. Nora closed her eyes again, but before she did, the corner of her mouth moved. Good, she said. We need one. Outside, the blizzard tore at the walls. The fire settled into its steady work. The children slept in their various arrangements of trust and exhaustion and hard-won proximity. And Elias Cord, who had spent 3 years trying to become someone who did not care about the outcome, sat in the firelight of an abandoned cabin in Wyoming and discovered that he had never succeeded. He had only been waiting for something large enough to make the pretending stop. He pulled his coat tighter and settled in for the night. He did not sleep. He watched over them, all 7, counting the rise and fall of each small chest the way he had once counted Eleanor's in the last days. Not from fear now, but from something different. Something that felt uncomfortably and undeniably like the first stages of love. Not the love you fall into. The love you choose in the dark when everything is difficult and nothing is guaranteed, and you choose it anyway because the alternative is a kind of dying that takes much longer than the real thing and hurts considerably more. He had been doing that slower dying for 3 years. It stopped somewhere in the dark hours of that night, between one breath and the next, between the last howl of the storm and the first tentative quiet that comes before dawn. It stopped, and something else took its place. He was not sure yet what to call it. But when Nora's fever broke, just before the light came, and he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and felt the heat recede beneath his touch, he allowed himself, briefly and without apology, to feel something he had not felt since the morning he stood at the edge of 2 graves and said goodbye to the life he had planned. He allowed himself to feel glad. The morning came in gray and slow, the way convalescence does, without drama, without announcement, just a gradual brightening of the world outside the cabin's single window, until the darkness became something you could see through. Elias had not slept. He had spent the night hours doing what he had always done in the hardest stretches of his medical life, making himself useful in small ways. Feeding the fire in careful increments so it never roared and never died, adjusting the blankets on the smaller children when they shifted and exposed themselves to the draft from the north wall, checking Nora's pulse and temperature at intervals he counted by the fire's behavior rather than any clock, watching the snow against the window glass with the attention of a man who has learned to read weather as a matter of survival. By the time the children began to wake, he had taken stock of everything they had between them, the supplies from both wagons consolidated and sorted. 2 full canteens plus the snowmelt pot he had kept going through the night. A half sack of dried beans, a smaller sack of cornmeal, 4 tins of preserved vegetables, a piece of salt pork the size of his fist. Enough for perhaps 4 days if he was careful. 3 if the children ate like children rather than survivors. There was also the root cellar. He had found the trapdoor in the cabin's far corner while the children slept, lifted it quietly, and climbed down into the cold dark with a burning stick from the fire. The cellar had partially collapsed on one side, but what remained was dry and untouched. 6 jars of preserved beets, 3 of pickled green beans, a crock of something that had once been apple butter. Not much, but more than nothing, and in a situation like this, more than nothing was the whole difference. Ada was the first child awake. He had noticed this about her, that she woke cleanly, without the gradual surfacing that most people required. One moment she was asleep with her back to the fire and Owen curled against her side. The next she was upright and looking at the room with full attention, cataloging it the way he had cataloged the ravine the night before. She looked at him across the cabin. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept a little." She accepted this without commenting on whether she believed it. "How is she?" "Better. Fever broke before dawn. She needs rest and water and real food when we can get it, but the immediate crisis has passed." Ada nodded and looked at the children still sleeping around her. She made a count of them with the same quiet gravity Nora had shown the night before. "What happens now?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, without the softening that adults usually applied to hard things when speaking to children. She did not want softening. She wanted information. "We stay here until the storm fully breaks and Mrs. Voss is strong enough to move," he said. "Then we make for Miller's Crossing, 15 miles east. There's a doctor there, proper supplies, law, and after that," he looked at her. "One problem at a time, Ada." She considered this and accepted it. "I can help with the younger ones today. Holt will be difficult when he fully wakes up. He cries and then he can't stop and it scares the others." She said this without judgment. "Cecily usually handles him, but Cecily is tired. I noticed. And Wren." Ada looked at the small girl still asleep in the corner, Owen's shoulder touching hers. "She won't eat if you try to hand her anything directly. You have to put it down near her and move away." Elias filed this. "You figured that out last night?" "I watched her for a while before I fell asleep." Ada met his eyes. "She's not broken. She's just learned that people reaching for her means something bad is coming. That takes time to unlearn." He studied this 10-year-old girl across the warmth of the fire and thought about all the ways the world had already tried to use her up and failed. "Where did you learn to read people like that?" "My mother," Ada said simply. "She said most people tell you exactly who they are if you pay attention to what they do instead of what they say." She paused. She was right. He wanted to say something about her mother, but there was nothing to say that would not cost Ada something she was not ready to pay. So he simply nodded and turned back to the fire. Holt woke 20 minutes later and cried for his father with the inconsolable quality of a 5-year-old who has been holding something enormous for too long. Cecily was on him immediately, with a practiced efficiency that confirmed what Ada had said, that she had been doing this for a while. She held him against her chest and rocked and did not try to tell him it would be all right, which Elias respected. She just held him and let him cry until he ran out of crying, which took longer than the cabin's acoustics could comfortably absorb. Wren did not react to the sound. She was awake, sitting in the corner with her knees drawn up and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. When the food was distributed, she would not take it from his hands. He placed the tin cup of cornmeal porridge near her feet and moved back to the fire, and within a few minutes, with Owen sitting next to her eating his own portion with focused attention, she began to eat. Owen still had not spoken. Elias watched the boy throughout the morning, not clinically but carefully, the way you watch something you want to understand. Owen moved through the world with a deliberateness that was different from withdrawal. He was present. He noticed things. When Holt's crying upset the younger children, he went and sat near Wren without being asked, apparently understanding that his proximity helped her. When Cecily struggled to get the fire poker into the correct position, Owen got up and adjusted it without a word, then returned to his place. He was not absent. He had simply found a different way of being in the world, one that did not require speech. Elias thought about that more than he expected to. The storm had eased by mid-morning to something that was no longer a blizzard but simply a heavy snowfall. The world outside the cabin window was the white of deep winter in Wyoming, absolute and unmarked, the kind of landscape that erases all evidence of human passage within an hour of that passage ending. Elias put on his coat. "Where are you going?" Nora asked. She had been awake for an hour, propped against the wall with blankets behind her, watching the room with the focused attention of a woman cataloging how her children were doing. She had not spoken much, conserving herself, but her eyes had missed nothing. "Hunting," Elias said. "We need meat." She looked at him steadily. "You're also going to check the perimeter." He paused. "I know what I saw when you came in last night," she said. "You checked at the approaches before you checked the children. That's not habit. That's concern." She held his gaze. "They're still out there." He sat down in front of her. If she was strong enough to think about this, she was strong enough to hear it straight. "Victor Crowe," he said. "That's the name you gave me last night when you were feverish." The man with the scar on his left cheek. Something moved through Nora's face. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise. The expression of someone who has known the name of the thing hunting them, and has been carrying that knowledge alone for a long time. "You know him," Elias said. I know of him. Daniel found out about him after. She shifted against the wall, and he could see the effort it cost her. 3 months ago, when they came the first time and killed Daniel, one of the men in town recognized the description. Said Crowe ran a loose outfit, 6 or 8 men at any given time, operating in the territory for 2 years. Takes wagon trains, isolated farms, anything that looks like it won't fight back. She stopped. They were wrong about us not fighting back. What was Crowe after? Nora was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved to the collar of her dress, to something beneath it, the cord of a small pouch that he had noticed the previous night and not addressed. She drew it out over her head and held it for a moment without opening it. Daniel's brother Calvin owns land in Montana, she said. 6,000 acres in the Bitterroot Valley. Good land. Calvin signed it over to Daniel before we left Kansas, wanted us to have it, said he was getting too old to manage it properly. She looked at the pouch in her hands. Daniel had the deed of transfer drawn up in Lawrence, official, notarized. He was going to file it in the Montana land office once we arrived. Elias looked at the pouch, and Crowe knows about it. Someone told him. I don't know who. Her jaw tightened. The land is worth more than I can calculate. To a mining interest, to a railroad, that kind of acreage in the Bitterroot would be worth a fortune. She finally opened the pouch and tipped the contents into her palm. A folded document, worn at the creases, official seal visible even at a distance. Daniel gave it to me the night before he died, Nora said. Told me to keep it close and not show anyone. I thought it was sentimentality. I thought he was giving me something of his to hold. She folded her hand around it again. He was trying to tell me. Elias looked at her. This is why he keeps coming back, he said. Not robbery. Not random violence. He needs that document. Without it, the transfer can't be completed. The land reverts to Calvin's estate, and Calvin has no surviving children. It would go to the county. She met his eyes. Crowe needs me alive long enough to tell him where it is. He needs the children to be a lever to make me talk. A pause. After that, we're a problem he would rather not have. The cabin was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow fell in its patient, indifferent way. All right, Elias said. He stood. I'm going to hunt. We need food, and I need to know what's moving out there. Ada is in charge while I'm gone. Nora almost smiled at that. She won't argue with you. I know. That's why I'm telling her and not asking. He crossed to Ada, who had been listening from across the room with the stillness of someone who has learned that appearing not to listen is the fastest way to hear everything. You heard, he said. Most of it. Can you hold things together here? She looked at him steadily. I kept Owen alive for 2 weeks before you found us. I can manage a morning. He believed her entirely. He was out in the snow for 2 hours before he found the deer. He tracked it patiently, reading the hoofprints in the fresh snow, moving downwind, placing each step with the care of a man who understands that the difference between success and failure in a snowfield is often a single sound at the wrong moment. He had hunted since boyhood, learned it from his father the way he had learned most useful things, quietly and by doing. The shot, when he took it, was clean. The animal went down without suffering, which mattered to him, and always had. He was field dressing the carcass when he smelled the smoke. Not wood smoke from the cabin. Different direction. East perhaps half a mile, and too much of it for a single fireplace. He left the deer and moved toward it. The camp was in a shallow depression between 2 ridgelines, sheltered from the prevailing wind in the calculated way of men who have been living rough for a long time and have developed strong opinions about comfort. 3 horses. A fire that was larger than it needed to be, which told him something about the confidence of the men around it. They were not hiding. 3 men. And tied to the base of a dead pine tree at the edge of the camp, her hands bound behind her, a young woman, 18 or 19. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her face carried a fresh bruise along her left cheekbone. She was not crying. She had the look of someone who had finished with crying as a response to this situation and was now somewhere beyond it, operating on something more austere. Elias watched from the ridge for 60 seconds, establishing what he was looking at. The men were armed, all 3 visible weapons, rifles leaned against a wagon wheel, handguns holstered. They had the ease of men who did not expect to be interrupted. One of them was speaking. He could not hear the words, but he could see the woman's response. A small, controlled stillness that was not passivity, but the most dangerous form of patience. He was calculating angles and distances when one of the men stood and walked toward her. He said something Elias still could not hear. The woman shook her head. The man hit her. The calculation ended. Elias stood up and walked down the ridge. They saw him coming when he was 40 yards out. He watched them reach the immediate wrong conclusion, which was that a single man walking openly toward them was not a threat. They started to stand, one of them reaching for the rifle against the wagon wheel, all 3 still inside the comfortable arithmetic of 3 against 1. He shot the nearest man in the shoulder before any of them had fully processed that he was already within range. The impact sat the man down hard in the snow with an expression of pure astonishment. The one reaching for the rifle got it halfway up before Elias's second shot took him in the leg and dropped him sideways. The rifle landed in the snow. The man grabbed it again with his good arm, and Elias crossed the remaining distance in 4 strides and stood on it. The third man had his handgun out. Elias looked at him. The man was somewhere in his mid-30s with a week of beard and eyes that were doing rapid arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not adding up in his favor. He had a gun. The man in front of him also had a gun. The man in front of him was closer. "Put it down," Elias said. A long moment. The gun went into the snow. He bound both mobile prisoners with rope from the camp's own supplies, which struck him as appropriate. He checked the shoulder wound on the first man, confirmed it had missed anything vital, and applied a field dressing from his coat pocket with the efficiency of long practice. Then he went to the woman at the tree. Her name, she told him while he worked at the knots, was Ruth Daly. She was 19. She had been traveling with her husband to visit his family when the men had taken them 2 days ago. Her husband was dead. She said this with the flat precision of shock, just the way very bad things sound when the person saying them has not yet fully arrived at them. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes. There's a cabin 3 miles north. There are children there, and a woman who has been through something similar. You'll be safe." Ruth looked at the 2 bound men in the snow, and then at the one still sitting holding his shoulder. "What about them? They come with us." He retrieved the deer on the way back. He arrived at the cabin to find Ada standing in the doorway with the rifle from his saddlebag across her arms, having heard him coming and positioned herself accordingly. She looked at the prisoners and then at Ruth and then back at Elias with the expression of someone recalibrating. "2 prisoners, 1 survivor," he said. "Start heating water. We need to eat, and then we need to talk about what happens next." He had anticipated that Nora would object to the plan. What he had not anticipated was the quality of her objection, which was not the fear he expected but something considerably more complicated. She listened to everything he told her about the camp, the men, the conversation he had gotten from the one who started talking once he understood that cooperation was his most comfortable option. 7 men total at the Johnson mine, 8 miles north, waiting for a signal that was not coming. Crowe himself was out there, mobile, which meant he was not at the mine and not accounted for. She listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still. "You need to go out there again," she said when he finished. It was not a question. "Crowe is mobile. He knows approximately where we are. If he finds this cabin before we can get to town, I know." She looked at him. "I know what happens if he finds us here." She glanced at the children and then back at him. "What do you need?" He had expected fear. He had not expected to find, underneath it, something harder and more useful. "I need to find him before he finds us," Elias said. "Talk to him. Get the specifics of where his men are positioned, what routes they're watching. If I can get that information, we can move to Miller's Crossing without walking into an ambush. And if you find him and it goes wrong, then you take the horses and go east at first light without waiting for me. Ada knows the direction." Ada, across the room, said nothing, but her expression communicated that she found this an unsatisfactory contingency. "I want to come with you," she said. "No, Mr. Cord. No, Ada. What I need from you is here." He held her gaze. "You are the reason the younger ones feel safe. Take that away and it doesn't matter what I do out there, you understand?" She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked at the children, at Owen sitting with Wren, at Holt asleep against Cecily's side, at June in her corner, still and watchful. She looked back at Elias. "Come back," she said. It was not a plea, it was a requirement. "That's the plan," he said. He went out into the dark. He found Crowe's camp an hour later, a smaller setup than the 3 men by the depression, just 1 fire and 1 tent and 2 horses, which told him this was a man who traveled fast and kept his resources mobile. Smart. Elias had already concluded that Crowe was smart, which made him considerably more dangerous than the average violent man. He took the guard without sound from behind, the chokehold he had learned from an army surgeon who had served in enough field situations to develop opinions about close quarters. Then he walked into the firelight. Crowe was seated on a camp stool reading a map by firelight. He looked up when Elias entered the circle of light, and his hand moved toward the pistol at his hip with the speed of a man who had developed that reflex over considerable time. He stopped when he saw that the reflex was already too late. The face matched what Nora had described. A hard face weathered past its age, with a scar along the left cheek that had healed without care and left a ridge of pale tissue from cheekbone to jaw. His eyes were an indeterminate color in the firelight, but their quality was specific, the quality of a man who was always calculating something. "You're the doctor," Crowe said. His voice was conversational. "You know who I am," Elias said. "I know what you've been doing. Moving that woman and her children across my territory, interfering with my business." He leaned back slightly on the stool, a studied ease that was its own kind of message. "I had you figured for a passing inconvenience. You're starting to seem like something else. Tell me about the men at the Johnson mine." Crowe smiled. It was not a warm expression. 7. "You won't manage them the way you managed my scouts, routes in and out. Why would I tell you that?" Elias looked at him steadily. "Because your other option is considerably less pleasant." Crowe looked at the gun, and then at Elias, and performed the same arithmetic every other man had performed that night and reached the same answer. He talked. 7 men, positioned in 2 groups, 1 watching the eastern road and 1 near the mine shaft itself. A timetable, 3 days before they would move if they received no signal. Backup meeting point at an abandoned church outside Miller's Crossing. Elias listened to all of it and remembered all of it. He had a doctor's memory, trained to retain detail without writing it down. Then he bound Crowe's hands and feet with the man's own belt and rope from the tent. Crowe looked up at him from the ground. The calculation in his eyes had shifted into something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but lived somewhere between the two. "You're going to leave me out here," he said. "Yes, that's not mercy. That's murder with extra steps." "It's the same chance you gave Daniel Voss," Elias said, "and the Daily Man from 2 days ago and everyone else your outfit has left in the snow." He looked at the man without heat, without performance. "It's more than you'd give me." He walked back toward the cabin. He was perhaps a quarter-mile out when he heard the shot. Not from behind him, from ahead, from the direction of the cabin. He ran. The snow was deep, and his side, where an old injury had never fully resolved, announced itself loudly with each stride. He ignored it and ran faster. Through the trees, over the ridge, down the slope. The cabin was lit from within. The door was intact, but there were boot prints in the snow on the east side of the building, the blind side with no window, and they were fresh. He came around the east wall and found the window on the south face had been forced, the shutter hanging from one hinge. He went through the door without slowing. 2 men inside, one near the door with a rifle, one with his hand in Nora's hair, dragging her head back. She was on her feet. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were blazing. The children were in the far corner. Ada stood in front of them with her arms spread wide, the rifle from the saddlebag aimed at the man holding Nora, and from the quality of her grip and her stance it was clear she had been standing there for some time and had not lowered it once. The man near the door turned toward Elias. Elias shot him in the leg. He went down hard and the rifle went with him. The man holding Nora was fast. He released her and had his own gun halfway up before Elias cleared the distance between them, and the next several seconds were the close, ugly, inelegant kind of violence that has nothing to recommend it except that it ends quickly and leaves the right people standing. It ended. Elias stood in the middle of the cabin. His side was bleeding through his shirt. He could feel it, a wet warmth spreading under his coat that he would need to address shortly. The room was silent except for the fire and Holt, somewhere behind Ada, making a small, continuous sound that was not quite crying. "Mr. Cord." Ada's voice was steady, but the rifle was still up, pointed at the man on the floor, and her knuckles were white around the stock. "You're bleeding." "I noticed," he said. "Sit down. Ada, sit down." The rifle did not waver. "I will deal with them. You sit down." He sat down. Nora crossed to him immediately and pulled his coat back to look at the wound. Her face was efficient, the bruise forming on her cheek making her expression more rather than less determined. "Through and through," she said. "Missed anything serious? You're going to need stitches." "I know." She looked at him. "I can stitch a wound." "I know that too." "Then sit still." Ada had moved to the prisoners while this exchange was happening, and was binding them with the competence of someone who had been paying attention to how these things were done. She worked without speaking, checked both knots twice, then set the rifle within reach and came back to Elias. She threaded the needle from his kit without asking where it was. "You found him," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "And?" "He's bound. 3 miles west. We have 3 days before his men move from the mine." He watched her steady hands as she worked the needle. "Ada, your hands are shaking." "I know," she said. "They started shaking after." She pushed the needle through and did not stop. "My papa said, the hands always shake after. He said the shaking means it mattered to you. He said you should worry about the day they don't shake." Elias watched her work in silence for a moment. "Where did you learn to do this?" "Watched my mother close a cut on our neighbor's arm 2 summers ago. I paid attention. You pay attention to everything." "I try to." She tied the final knot and cut the thread. "It's the only advantage a person my size has." He looked at her, this girl who had cried in a calculated way to save her brother's life, who had put a medical bag into a grown man's hands and told him he didn't have the right to stop being himself, who had just held a rifle on 2 armed men in the dark without shaking until after it was over. "We need to move at first light," he said. "Miller's Crossing. All of us." Ada looked at Nora, who was wrapping a clean bandage around the stitched wound with precise hands. "She's not strong enough," Ada said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "But we're out of alternatives." Nora looked up from the bandage. "I'm right here," she said. "And I'm stronger than either of you is giving me credit for." Elias and Ada looked at each other. Nora went back to wrapping the bandage. "First light," she said. "I'll be ready." The night passed without further incident. Elias allowed himself 3 hours of sleep, genuine sleep, with Ada keeping watch with the rifle across her knees and an alertness he would have trusted in a soldier twice her age. He woke before dawn to find Owen sitting beside him. The boy was looking at him with those present, careful eyes. In the thin pre-dawn light, his face was older than 8 in the ways that mattered, and exactly 8 in the ways that broke your heart. Elias looked back at him and did not try to fill the silence with anything. After a while, Owen reached out and put his hand briefly on Elias's arm. Not a grip, just a placement, a brief, deliberate contact. Then he withdrew it and looked at the fire. Elias did not know what it meant exactly. He knew what it felt like, and he thought that was probably enough. He got up and started preparing for the day. Miller's Crossing was 15 miles east. The storm had broken in the night, leaving a sky that was cold and clear and pale as bone. The kind of sky that held no more immediate threat and allowed you to think one step ahead for the first time in days. They loaded everything into the wagons just after first light. Nora on the seat of the lead wagon with Cecily and Holt beside her, wrapped in everything they had that was warm. Ada drove the second wagon with Owen next to her, their 2 prisoners bound in the back. Wren rode with Elias on Dust, positioned in front of him with his coat around both of them, because she had allowed this without flinching and he was not going to question it. June sat in the back of Ada's wagon, watching the tree line with the silent vigilance that had not left her since the burning farm. He rode ahead, scanning the road, scanning the ridgeline, reading the landscape the way his father had taught him and his own years had refined. 2 miles out from Miller's Crossing, with the morning light fully established and the road clear, Ada called forward from the second wagon. "Mr. Cord." He turned. She was looking at something off the road to the north. He followed her gaze. Smoke, too much of it, rising from beyond the next ridge in a column that was dark and heavy with the quality of a structure burning. Not a campfire, something larger and angrier. He reined Dust in. He looked at the smoke. He looked at the road ahead, at Miller's Crossing 15 minutes away, at the children in the wagons, at Nora who was watching him with an expression that told him she had already understood the situation and its implications. "Stay on the road," he told her. "Keep moving east. Don't stop for anything until you reach the sheriff's office. Elias, I'll be 20 minutes behind you, 30 at most." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was in her eyes, and what he saw there was not fear. It was the expression of a woman who has made her calculations and knows that there is only one man in front of her, and only one thing he is capable of doing when he sees smoke and thinks there might be someone in it. 20 minutes, she said. He turned Dust north toward the smoke. The farmstead was mostly gone by the time he reached it. The barn was fully down, black timbers scattered like thrown sticks. The house was still standing but burning from the inside out, the roof beginning to buckle. 3 men stood between him and the fire with the ease of men who had done this before and found the aftermath comfortable. He recognized the look. He had seen it at the ravine, at the camp, at the cabin. The relaxation in their faces that comes from a long history of unchallenged action. At the edge of the house, pressed against the burning wall with her knees drawn up and her face turned away, was a child, 8 or 9 years old. Dark hair, arms wrapped around herself. She was not moving, but she was breathing. He could see the movement of her shoulders from 30 yards. He dismounted. The men saw him the same way all the others had, with that initial miscalculation. He did not let them finish it. What followed was brief and loud and left 2 men alive and capable of standing, which was sufficient for his purposes. He bound them without ceremony and left them in the snow. Then he went to the girl. She did not react to his approach. She was staring at the burning house with the fixed expression of someone who has just watched their entire world become smoke and has not yet found another place to put their attention. He sat down on the frozen ground beside her. Not close, not touching, just present in the way he had watched Owen be present for Wren. After a while she spoke. "They killed my mama," she said, "and my papa, and my brother Thomas." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry, Thomas was 7. She blinked slowly. He was afraid of the dark. I always had to leave a lamp for him. Elias said nothing. There was nothing to say. He simply stayed where he was. After another silence, she said, "Are you going to take me somewhere?" "Yes. There are other children, and a woman who will look after you properly. It's not far." She looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were dry. She had already spent whatever she had on crying, the exhaustion of a grief that has been too large and too sudden to process in real time. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias Cord. Mine's June," she said. "Hello, June." She looked at the burning house for another moment. Then she stood up, brushing snow from her coat with the automatic gesture of a child whose mother had probably told her many times to keep her clothes clean. She did not take his hand. She walked beside him toward the horse. When they reached the road, he saw in the distance the wagon still moving east, smaller now but visible, Ada's dark coat on the second wagon's seat, the measured pace of horses that had been asked for one more effort and were providing it. He lifted June onto Dust's back and mounted behind her. He looked at the column of smoke behind them, at the burned farm, at the 2 bound men in the snow. Then he turned east and did not look back. Miller's Crossing appeared at the end of the road in the long golden light of mid-afternoon, larger than he had expected. 50 or 60 buildings along a main street with wooden walkways and the activity of a place that was alive and continuing regardless of what happened in the wilderness outside it. He could see the church steeple at the far end. He could see a building with iron bars on the windows halfway down the main street. He rode in behind the wagons. The townspeople stopped what they were doing and looked. He did not blame them. They were looking at 2 battered wagons, 7 children, a pregnant woman with a bruise on her cheek, 2 bound prisoners in the back of the second wagon, and a man on a gray horse with a child in front of him and dried blood on his coat. He dismounted in front of the building with the iron bars and pushed through the door. The man behind the desk looked up from his newspaper. "Help you, stranger?" "I need the sheriff," Elias said. The man set down the paper and stood. He was tall, broad across the chest, with the quality of someone who had made peace with difficult things and carried that peace as a kind of weight rather than a lightness. A star on his vest caught the lamplight. "Sheriff Aldous Vane," the man said. "And you are?" "Elias Cord. I have 4 prisoners outside who belong to an outfit that's been operating in this territory for 2 years. The leader is a man named Victor Crowe. I have a woman and 7 children who are witnesses to murder and robbery. I have a signed confession from one of the men." Elias met the sheriff's eyes. "And I have 3 days before the rest of his gang comes looking for him." Aldous Vane looked at him for a moment. Then he reached for his coat. "Show me," he said. Sheriff Aldous Vane was a man who made decisions the way good surgeons do, quickly, without performance, and without revisiting them once they were made. He looked at the wagons and the children and the prisoners and Nora's bruised face and the blood on Elias's coat, and within 10 minutes he had deputies moving in 3 directions. 2 prisoners into the jail. Doc Greer sent for. The church at the end of the street opened and heated. A woman named Mrs. Halbert, who apparently ran the boarding house and had opinions about everything, dispatched to organize food and blankets with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for a worthy problem. Elias watched all of this from the steps of the sheriff's office and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The specific relief of not being the only person responsible for what happened next. He let Vane's deputies take the prisoners. He let Mrs. Halbert take the children, which Ada permitted with the expression of someone choosing to trust rather than naturally feeling it. He let Doc Greer, a gray-haired man of 60 with hands that still moved with precision, take Nora by the arm and guide her toward the church where the light was better. He stood on the steps in the cold afternoon air and breathed. Then he went inside to talk to the sheriff. Vane listened the way good listeners do, without interrupting, without the impatient nodding that means a person is waiting for their turn to speak rather than actually hearing. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his eyes on Elias's face and let the whole of it come out in order. The ravine, the cabin, the attack in the night, the confrontation with Crowe, the Johnson mine and the 7 men waiting there, the 3-day window. When Elias finished, Vane was quiet for a moment. "Victor Crowe," he said. "I've had his name on a piece of paper in that drawer for 8 months. He nodded at the desk. 6 complaints, no witnesses willing to sign their names. The ones who survived what his outfit did mostly wanted to get as far from the territory as possible, rather than come back and testify." He looked at Elias. "You've got witnesses." "I've got witnesses," Elias confirmed, "and one of the prisoners will give you everything in writing." He started talking before I finished tying his hands. "The young one?" "Yes." Vane nodded slowly. "The young ones always do. They sign on thinking it's going to be something else, and then it turns out to be exactly what it looked like, and they can't find a way to feel righteous about it." He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the desk. "The mine is 8 miles north. I've got 4 deputies, all of them capable. We can move tonight. Tonight puts you there in the dark against 7 armed men in a fortified position. Dawn then, first light. That gives us roughly 14 hours. Elias paused. "Crowe is still unaccounted for." Vane's eyes sharpened. "You left him bound, 3 miles west of the cabin. That was 8 hours ago." He held the sheriff's gaze. "He had help. Somewhere in this picture there is someone who has been feeding him information. He knew about the land deed. He knew the approximate route the Voss family was taking. He knew things that required a source." Vane absorbed this without visible alarm, which Elias respected. An alarmed lawman was a less useful one. "You think he's loose," Vane said. "I think we should plan as if he is." The sheriff stood and went to the window that looked out onto the main street. The afternoon light was going now, the short winter day collapsing toward evening, and the street had the quiet of a place that does not yet know it is in danger. "All right," Vane said. "Here's what we do." They planned for an hour. Elias laid out the terrain around the Johnson mine as precisely as he could from Crowe's description and the geography he had covered in the past 2 days. Vane knew the area and filled in what Elias did not have. By the time they were done, they had something that was not a perfect plan, because perfect plans required information they did not have, but was a solid one which was considerably more useful. Elias left the sheriff's office and went to the church. The children had been fed. He could tell by the way the room felt that settling that happens when people who have been hungry for a long time have eaten enough. Holt was asleep against Mrs. Halbert's considerable side, which she appeared to find entirely natural. Cecily sat next to him with her eyes open and her hands in her lap, awake but somewhere far away. Ada was at the window, looking out at the street with the rifle no longer in her hands, but her posture not having entirely forgiven the absence. Owen and Wren were in the corner, as they always seemed to be, their shoulders touching, Owen's eyes tracking the room while Wren looked at the fire. June was sitting near the fire by herself, not unhappy, simply contained. She had found a piece of charred wood somewhere and was drawing on the stone hearth with it. Careful lines, a shape that might have been a house or a mountain, but the deliberateness of it said something important about who she was going to become. Elias sat down near Ada. "How is she?" Ada said, still looking at the window. "Resting. Doc Greer says she needs complete bed rest for at least a week. The baby is fine. She is going to be fine." Ada nodded. The quality of the nod told him she had been holding this possibility at arm's length until he confirmed it. "And Crowe?" she asked. He looked at her. "I may have underestimated his resources." Ada turned from the window. "You think he got loose. I think we need to behave as if he did." She held his gaze. "What do you need me to do?" Stay with the children tonight. All of you in this room, door locked, and you keep the rifle. Mrs. Halbert's husband is outside, and he knows to call for the deputy if anything looks wrong. And you? I'll be with Vane, going over the approach to the mine. He paused. First light, the deputies move on the Johnson mine. This ends tomorrow. Ada looked at him with those eyes that had been old since before he met her. You say that like you're certain. I say that because the alternative is not useful. She almost smiled. It moved across her face and was gone. My father used to say something like that. He sounds like he was a sensible man. He was. She looked back at the window. He would have liked you, I think. He was suspicious of people who made things look easy. He trusted people who showed the work. Elias had nothing adequate to say to that, so he said nothing. And after a moment, Ada went back to looking at the street, and he went to check on Nora. She was in the small room behind the church that served as the pastor's study, on a cot that Doc Greer had arranged with more care than the space usually warranted. She was awake when he came in, her hands on her stomach, her face carrying the expression of a woman who is monitoring something internal with great attention. How do you feel? He asked. Tired, less frightened than I was this morning. She looked at him. That's progress. He sat in the chair beside the cot. Greer says you need a week of bed rest before you can travel. I know, he told me. She shifted slightly. Is that going to be a problem? No. Vane moves on the mine at first light. If we can take Crowe's remaining men before they disperse, this territory becomes considerably safer for everyone. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the church wall, the town made its ordinary evening sounds, horses and voices, and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer finishing up the day's work. Elias, she said. Yes, the land deed. She touched the cord at her neck. The pouch was still there. I've been thinking about it. You don't have to think about it tonight, I know, but I want to. She looked at the low ceiling. Daniel wanted that land for the children, for a future. That was the whole of the plan. Get to Montana, build something real, give the children a place that was theirs. Her voice was level. He died for it without knowing that's what he was doing. He died trying to protect us from something he didn't fully understand. She stopped. I'm not going to let that deed be the reason his children spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Elias waited. If Crowe is caught and tried, the deed becomes a legal matter. A court matter. It becomes something we settle with documents instead of rifles. She met his eyes. That's what Daniel would have wanted. He believed in courts and documents. He believed the law was worth using. He was a school teacher, Elias said. He was. And he was right about more things than he was wrong about. A pause. I want to file the deed properly once this is over. Get it recorded in the Montana land office. Take the children there in the spring. She looked at him. All of them. He heard what she was including in that word and did not address it directly. Not tonight. One thing at a time, he said. I know. She closed her eyes. You're going to tell me to sleep. You need to sleep. I know that too. Her hand found his in the dark beside the cot. Her grip was warm and steady. Come back tomorrow, she said. After. I will. He sat with her until her breathing evened out, and then he went back to the sheriff's office and went over the plan again with Vane, until they had covered every contingency they could think of. And then he found a corner of the jail's back room and slept for 4 hours with the focused efficiency of a man who has learned to take rest when it is available, because it will not always be. He woke to Ada shaking his shoulder in the dark. Something's wrong, she said. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, the old reflexes from too many middle-of-the-night medical calls firing before his conscious mind had fully arrived. What is it? Deputy Marsh came to the church 20 minutes ago, said there was a disturbance on the north end of town. Then he didn't come back. Ada was already dressed and had the rifle in her hands. Mrs. Halbert's husband isn't outside anymore. The children are locked in with Mrs. Halbert, and she has her husband's shotgun. Where's Vane? I don't know. I came straight here. He buckled his gun belt in the dark and moved to the door. The main street was empty and quiet in the way that streets are never quite empty at 3 in the morning. Always some small movement, a horse shifting in a stable, a lamp in an upstairs window, the sound of wind moving between buildings. He stood in the doorway and read the street the way he had been reading landscapes for 2 days. There, a shape at the far end of the street near the church, not moving, too still to be casual. He touched Ada's arm. Go back to the church. Go around the outside, through the alley. Don't use the street. Elias, do you trust me? A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Yes, then go. She went, moving into the dark between buildings with the quiet efficiency that still struck him as remarkable in a child her age. He waited until she was out of sight, and then he moved in the opposite direction, using the boarding house's overhang for cover, moving along the far side of the street toward the shape he had seen. It resolved itself as he got closer. Not a man, a post with something tied to it. He got close enough to see what it was and stopped. A note. He took it down and read it in the pale light from a nearby window. One sentence, clear and unambiguous. Bring the deed to the mill at the edge of town. Come alone. Bring the girl, Ada. He stood with the note in his hand for a moment, reading it twice to make sure he had understood exactly what it said and what it meant. Crowe had been watching. Crowe had seen enough of how this family operated to understand what lever to reach for. He had not asked for Nora, who was bedridden and whose mobility was limited. He had not asked for Owen or Wren or any of the younger ones. He had asked for Ada. Because he had watched Elias long enough to understand that Ada was the one Elias would move mountains for. Not because she was the most vulnerable, but because she was the one holding everything else together, and losing her would undo all of it. Crowe was smarter than he looked. That was the most dangerous kind of enemy. Elias put the note in his pocket. He went back to the church through the alley, moving fast and quiet. Ada was inside when he arrived, standing near the door with the rifle, the children behind her in their various arrangements of sleep and wary wakefulness. "He's in town," Elias said. Ada looked at him without surprise. "I know. I saw a man watching the church from the alley when I came through. He didn't see me. He left a note. He wants the deed, and he wants you." Watched her face. "He's using you as a lever." She absorbed this, because he's figured out I matter to you. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Owen across the room had woken and was watching them with those precise eyes of his. He had heard. He always heard. "What's the plan?" Ada asked. "I go to the mill. I don't take you. He'll know." "Yes, but he needs the deed more than he needs you. You're a lever, not an objective. When I arrive without you, he'll have to recalculate, and recalculating costs time." He looked at her steadily. "And Vane will be behind me. You've already talked to Vane. I sent word through the deputy's runner 3 minutes ago." Ada looked at him. "You planned this on the walk from the street." "I planned the outline. The details are ongoing." He held her gaze. "What I need from you is to stay here and keep the door locked and not open it for anyone except me or Vane. Can you do that?" "Yes." She said it without hesitation and then said, "Elias." He was already turning to go. "Don't be careless," she said. "We need you back." He looked at her, and at Owen watching from across the room, and at the smaller shapes of sleeping children in the firelight. "I know," he said. "That's the plan." The mill was at the north edge of town, its wheels stilled against the ice of the mill race. Elias came at it from the south along the creek bank, keeping the mill structure between himself and whatever was on the other side. He stopped at the corner of the building. "I know you're there, Cord." Crowe's voice came from inside the mill, through the open loading door on the upper level. Controlled, unhurried. "I also know you didn't bring the girl." "That was never going to happen," Elias said. "No, I suppose not." A pause. "You're a harder read than most. Most men, you tell them bring someone or someone dies, they bring the someone. You come alone and rearrange the problem. Where's the deputy?" "Sleeping. He'll wake up with a headache." Don't kill people I don't need to kill." Elias filed this. A man with limits was a more predictable man. "Come out, Crowe. You're done. I've still got the high ground and a rifle, and you've got a pistol and some admirable determination." He could hear the smile in it. "I don't think I'm done yet. Your men at the Johnson mine are surrounded. Vane sent a rider out 2 hours ago. Territorial Marshal was already moving before I got to Miller's Crossing. Vane had sent for him yesterday." This was not entirely true, but the parts that mattered were accurate enough. "Whatever you were building here is over. The only question now is whether you're alive when it finishes." A silence. Then from the darkness behind Elias and to his left, a sound he almost missed. Almost. He was already turning when the shot came from inside the mill, aimed at the space he had just vacated. He felt the wind of it pass his shoulder, and then he was against the mill wall, returning fire through the loading door. 2 shots in rapid succession into the dark interior. A crash. Something falling. Then nothing. He waited for 10 seconds that felt like a different kind of time. Then he moved to the loading door and looked in. Crowe was on the floor of the mill, his rifle 3 feet away, his right hand pressed to his side. Alive, he was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man performing a rapid reassessment of his situation. Standing in the shadows near the far wall, a slingshot dangling from his hand, was Owen. Elias stared at the boy. Owen looked back at him with his specific, unreadable calm. The stone that had deflected Crowe's aim, that had struck the rifle barrel at the precise moment Crowe fired and sent the shot wide, lay on the mill floor between them. A river stone, smooth and gray, the size of an egg. Elias looked at it and then at Owen. Owen set the slingshot down carefully on a nearby crate and walked toward Elias, and as he walked he spoke. "I followed you," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper, with the quality of something that had been kept in a very cold place for a very long time and was only now beginning to find its temperature. Ada said stay. I came anyway. Elias looked at this boy who had not spoken since watching his parents die in the snow. Owen stopped in front of him and looked up. "I knew you'd come back for us," Owen said. "Every time. But I thought this time you might need someone to come back for you." Elias went down to one knee. He did not plan to. His legs simply made the decision, and he followed it. He put his arms around Owen and held on, and Owen held back with the fierce grip of a child who has been holding himself together by force of will for a very long time and has finally found somewhere to put the weight of it. He did not speak. There were no words in him that were adequate. He simply held the boy in the dark mill while Victor Crowe lay on the floor 10 feet away and the mill race ticked against its ice outside, and somewhere in the distance he could hear boots on the wooden walkway that meant Vane and his deputies were coming. It was over. It took 3 hours to finish the official business of it. Crowe into custody, the wounded side assessed by Elias himself, the man's condition confirmed as serious but not mortal, which was the appropriate outcome. The 2 deputies who had been watching the mill's other exit brought in from the cold. The runner sent to the group moving on the Johnson mine with the updated information that the operations leader was in custody and resistance was pointless. Owen sat on a crate in the mill and watched all of it with the quiet attention he brought to everything, and did not speak again that night, and Elias did not push him to. The words had come when they needed to. They would come again when there were more that needed saying. Vane pinned a deputy's star to Elias's coat at some point during the proceedings, a brief ceremony that consisted of the sheriff producing the badge from his vest pocket, and Elias raising his right hand, and Vane saying the words, and both of them moving on without further comment. It was the most efficient official appointment Elias had ever witnessed, and it suited him exactly. He walked Owen back to the church through the quiet town in the hour before dawn, the boy's hand in his, neither of them speaking. Ada opened the door before they reached it. She had been watching from the window. She looked at Owen, and then at Elias, and then at Owen again, and the expression on her face in the lamplight was the only thing she allowed herself by way of relief. A single moment of it, unguarded, and then it was replaced by the practical expression she wore the rest of the time. "You went after him," she said to Owen. Owen looked at her. "You said, stay. I know what I said. I thought he might need someone." Ada looked at her brother for a long moment. Then she put her hand on top of his head briefly, the way she had probably done 1,000 times before all of this, the automatic gesture of an older sister. "Next time," she said, "tell me first." Owen appeared to consider this as a reasonable amendment and nodded. They went inside. The trial was set for 3 weeks out, time enough for the territorial circuit judge to make his way from Cheyenne, and for the written testimonies to be compiled, and for the full accounting of Crowe's operation to be assembled from the various confessions and cross-reference statements that Vane's deputies collected in the days following the arrests. Judge Harlan Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday with snow on his coat and the specific energy of a man who takes justice personally. He was 60, lean, with the face of someone who has heard a great many stories and developed finely calibrated instruments for detecting the ones that are not true. He had served as a judge in Wyoming territory for 11 years and had, according to Vane, never been accused of being lenient. The courtroom was the largest room in town, which was the church. The pews turned to face a table and chair that served as the bench. Every seat was occupied. People stood along the walls. Elias sat in the front row with Nora beside him, her hands in her lap, her back straight with the effort of it because she had been in bed for 3 weeks, and her body was still arguing with her about vertical. The children were in the boarding house with Mrs. Halbert, who had developed, over the course of 3 weeks, the attachment that certain practical women develop toward things that need organizing and caring for. She ran a tight household, and the children, even Holt, had responded to its structure with the relief of people who have been without order for a long time. Wren had spoken her first word in the boarding house 6 days after their arrival. She had said it to Owen. The word was his name. She had been reaching across the breakfast table for the salt, and had said quietly, without fanfare, "Owen," and he had passed it to her, and the moment had passed without comment from anyone, which was exactly the right response. Ada had told Elias about it that evening. He had received the information with the gravity it deserved. The testimonies at trial lasted 2 days. The young prisoner, whose name was Clem Boward and who was 22 years old and had a mother in Nebraska who did not know what her son had been doing for the past 18 months, gave his testimony first. He had clearly rehearsed it. He was terrified and thorough, and he left nothing out. Names, dates, locations, the full accounting of what Crowe's outfit had done in the territory over 2 years. The list was long enough that Judge Pruitt's expression, already set at austere, moved toward something colder. Elias testified second. He was precise and chronological, and he did not editorialize. He described what he had found and what he had done and what he had observed, and when Crowe's lawyer, a man from Cheyenne who had the look of someone doing the least enjoyable work of his career, tried to characterize the violence at the mine and the mill as excessive, Elias looked at him and said, 7 children. A pregnant woman. 2 years of unprosecuted murders. I would describe my response as measured, and the courtroom made a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite applause, but was somewhere between the two. Nora testified last. She walked to the chair that served as the witness stand with her back straight and her hands folded, and she looked at the courtroom with the expression of a woman who has decided that this is the last time she is going to be required to be afraid and intends to see it through without flinching. She told the court about Daniel, about Lawrence, Kansas, and the deed of transfer, and the morning they had set out for Montana with everything they owned, and a future they had planned carefully and believed in completely. She told it in the plain, unembellished way of someone for whom the plain facts are sufficient, because the plain facts were terrible enough without decoration. She talked about the night Daniel died. She did not look away from the courtroom when she said it. She talked about the months of flight that followed, the kindness of strangers, and the morning she found Wren alone and brought her along because there was no other choice. She talked about the cabin and the blizzard and the man who had turned his horse around when he heard a child crying in the snow. At this point she looked at Elias briefly, and he held her gaze. She finished with Miller's Crossing and what had happened in the mill, and when she was done the courtroom was very quiet. Victor Crowe was convicted on all counts. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes, which Judge Pruitt later described as the longest 40 minutes of the proceedings given what he felt about the evidence. Crowe received the sentence that the territory's law prescribed for the crimes he had committed, and he received it with the expression of a man who has been calculating his odds since childhood and has finally run out of better outcomes. Clem Boward received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony and his cooperation, and the general assessment by Judge Pruitt that the young man had made terrible choices but had not made them from the same place Crowe had. He would serve 4 years. Whether that was justice was a question Elias did not try to answer. It was the law, and the law was what Daniel Voss had believed in, and that felt like enough. Elias and Nora walked out of the church into the cold December afternoon and stood on the steps and breathed the air, which was clean and sharp and smelled of pine and wood smoke and the freshness that comes after snow. "It's done," Nora said. "Yes." She stood with that for a moment. He watched her absorb it, the full weight of what done meant, the ending of something that had been pressing on her since the night outside Lawrence when everything changed. "I want to file the deed," she said, "as soon as we can travel. Get to Montana and file it properly and let that be the last piece of it." "Spring," he said. "When the passes are clear and you're fully recovered." She looked at him. The afternoon light was low and coming at an angle that caught the side of her face, and she looked both exactly like herself and like the woman she was going to be once the immediate weight lifted and she had room to become her next version. "I have something to ask you," she said. "All right." She looked at the street, at the ordinary late afternoon movement of the town, and then back at him. "You've been here 3 weeks. Greer's been talking about retiring for 2 years, and he told me last Tuesday that he thinks you're the reason he might actually do it. Vane asked me if I thought you'd consider a permanent appointment." She paused. "The children have started calling you something." He was quiet. "Ada calls you Elias because Ada calls everyone by their name, but the others." She stopped again. "Owen called you something yesterday, when Mrs. Halbert asked him who had taught him to play checkers." He knew what Owen had said. Mrs. Halbert had told him in a roundabout way that was her manner of delivering significant information while pretending to discuss the state of the boarding house's firewood. He had spent the better part of 2 days with it. "Nora," he said, "I'm not asking you to replace anything," she said. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not or to pretend the past didn't happen. I know about Eleanor. I know what she cost you and what Margaret cost you, and I know you spent 3 years trying to become someone who couldn't lose anything because you'd already lost everything." She met his eyes. "I'm asking if you want to stop trying to be that person." He looked at her. He thought about the bag, closed for 3 years, and about Ada's hands placing it in his. He thought about Owen in the mill, the stone on the floor, the boy's voice coming out of long silence. He thought about Wren learning to say a name, and June drawing on the hearth, and Cecily's practiced hand smoothing her brother's hair. He thought about Holt asking if he could fix people the way he fixed broken things, and about the answer he had given. He thought about Eleanor, her stethoscope borrowed and pressed to her doll's chest, her grave expression as she announced the patient would survive. She would have liked it here, he thought. She would have liked these children. She would have appointed herself Owen's protector and Wren's teacher, and she would have told Ada, with complete seriousness, that she intended to be a doctor too. He thought that was probably what Ada had meant when she said Eleanor would have wanted him to save other people's Eleanors. He thought that was probably true. "Yes," he said. Nora looked at him steadily. "Yes, you want to stop trying, or yes to the whole of it?" "Yes to the whole of it." She put her hand in his. They were married in the church at the end of December, the same church that had served as a courtroom 3 weeks before, which struck Elias as appropriately efficient. The pastor, a spare man named Reverend Cole, who had a gift for brevity, kept the ceremony to its necessary elements, which was exactly what both of them had asked for. Sheriff Vane stood as witness. Mrs. Halbert cried in the front pew, which she had apparently decided in advance she was entitled to do. The children sat in a row. Ada, straight-backed, her hands folded, watching the proceedings with the expression of someone who has orchestrated an outcome and is pleased with how it turned out without being willing to take public credit. Owen next to her with his shoulder touching hers, watching Elias with those careful eyes, and when Elias looked at him during the vows, Owen gave a single small nod that meant something Elias could not fully translate but did not need to. Cecily with her hand over her brother Holt's mouth preemptively, which suggested she had correctly anticipated something Holt was about to say. Wren watching the candles on the altar with the new quality she had been developing lately, not the locked terror but something approaching wonder. June with a stub of pencil she had been given and a piece of paper on her knee, sketching something, because June sketched everything now, as if the world needed to be recorded before it changed again. The vows were simple. Elias had written his own, not from any particular romantic impulse, but because he wanted to say precisely what he meant, and he had found over the past weeks that the things he wanted to say were specific enough that the standard words would not contain them. He looked at Nora and said, "I spent 3 years trying to become a man who had nothing to lose. I understand now that I was wrong about what that means. A man with nothing to lose is not safe. He is simply empty. You and these children have made me full again, and I intend to spend whatever time I am given being worthy of that." Nora said, "I married Daniel because I loved him and I believed in what we were building." I marry you because I love you and because you showed me that what we were building did not have to stop when he died. It only had to change shape. I am grateful for the shape it has taken." Reverend Cole pronounced them married. Holt said, loudly and with complete sincerity. Finally, Cecily removed her hand from his mouth 1 second too late. The church laughed. 3 days after the wedding, in the small hours of a January morning, Nora woke Elias with a hand on his arm and a single word. "Now," she said. He delivered his own daughter. It was the strangest and most complete experience of his medical life, bringing into the world a child who was his in every sense that mattered. His hands the first to hold her, her first sound directed at his face because his face was the first thing she saw. He was accustomed to the practical intensity of a birth, to the requirement that the clinical mind stay in the foreground regardless of everything else. But there was a moment, when he had her, when she was breathing and present and furious about it, in the way that newborns are furious, when the clinical mind stepped back without asking permission, and something else came forward. He had not expected to feel that thing again. He had not expected to feel that anything was possible again. He wrapped her and placed her in Nora's arms and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at them both in the lamplight and thought about the word that Owen had used in the mill, the word that had not stopped resonating since. Some things are worth being scared for. Yes, he thought. This. Exactly this. They named her Hope. He had suggested it, and Nora had looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read, and then said yes without qualification or amendment, as if the word had been waiting for both of them to arrive at it from different directions. Hope Cord. 2 days later, Ada appeared in the doorway of the room where Nora was resting with Hope asleep on her chest, and Ada looked at the baby with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Elias had ever seen on her face, pure and young and entirely without the protective layering she usually maintained. "Hello," Ada said to Hope very quietly. Hope, who was 2 days old and unconscious, did not respond. "She's going to be trouble," Ada said. "Probably," Nora agreed. "Good." Ada looked at Nora with those old young eyes. "We know how to handle trouble." Spring came the way spring comes to Wyoming, argumentatively, in fits of warmth followed by retreats into cold, the snow going gray and granular at the edges before it finally gave up entirely and became mud and then green. The children emerged from the winter the way the landscape did, slowly, by degrees, revealing things that had been there all along under the surface. They made for Montana in April when the passes were clear and Nora declared herself recovered, which she announced once and did not repeat because she felt that once was sufficient, and she was correct. The wagons were loaded with everything they had accumulated over the winter, which was more than they had arrived with, because a town that has witnessed what you have survived tends to fill the gaps. Tools, provisions, seed, 2 additional horses, a crate of books that Reverend Cole sent along because he had heard that the children were readers and believed this was a condition to be encouraged. They took the northern route, following the advice of a rancher Vane knew who had made the same journey twice and had opinions about which passes held snow longest. It took 3 weeks. They arrived in the Bitterroot Valley on a morning in early May when the mountains were still white at their peaks, and the valley floor was the green that only comes in the first weeks of spring, that urgent green of things that have been waiting a long time and are not wasting the opportunity. The land was exactly what the deed had described. 6,000 acres of valley and slope and creek bottom and timber, Daniel Voss's gift to his family and his family's future, paid for in a currency he had not intended to spend. Elias stood at the edge of the property that first morning and looked at it for a long time. Ada came and stood beside him. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's a lot of land, it is." She looked at it with her usual assessment, practical and thorough. "We're going to need help. We can't work all of this ourselves. No, we'll take what we can manage and let the rest be itself for now. It'll keep." She nodded, then she said, "Are you going to set up a practice here?" He had been thinking about this. There was no doctor within 30 miles of the valley. The nearest settlement was a small town called Ridge Creek, 2 hours' ride, that had a general store and a post office and nothing medical beyond what its residents had taught themselves from necessity. "Yes," he said, "when we're settled. People will come from a long way. People in need of a doctor usually do." Ada was quiet for a moment. "I want to learn," she said. "Properly. Everything you know." He looked at her. "I know I'm 10, she said. "I'm not asking to practice medicine tomorrow. I'm asking you to teach me. The way a doctor teaches someone who is going to be a doctor." She held his gaze. "I have time." He thought about what she had already demonstrated she was capable of, the needle in her steady hands. The wound closed cleanly and without flinching. The way she had read Wren's terror and the children's dehydration, and Cecily's bruised ribs with the observation of someone already trained to notice what others overlook. "All right," he said. She nodded once, satisfied, and walked back toward the wagons where Mrs. Halbert, who had come along because she had decided she was coming along and that had been the end of the discussion, was directing the unloading of the crates with considerable authority. Elias stood alone at the edge of the land for a few more minutes. He thought about Daniel Voss, whom he had never met, who had been a schoolteacher from Kansas, who believed in words and courts, and the law and the specific goodness of having a place that belonged to your children. He thought about the night Daniel died, not knowing what he was protecting, only knowing that it was worth protecting. He thought Daniel would have found it acceptable, what his land had become. He thought he would have approved of the noise a family of 9 made when it was unpacking and settling and arguing about where things should go. He thought Daniel Voss had understood something that Elias had spent 3 years trying to unlearn and had only recently remembered, that the point was not to be safe from loss. The point was to choose what was worth losing over, and then to choose it fully, without reservation, with both hands. He walked back to his family. The house they built that first summer was modest by any measure, 2 stories of timber and stone set against the slope where it would be sheltered from the prevailing wind, with a porch that faced the valley and a view that made the modesty irrelevant. Elias built it with his own hands and the hands of his older children and the help of neighbors who arrived from Ridge Creek and surrounding properties, because that was what people did in the Bitterroot in 1879. They showed up when there was building to be done. Owen turned out to have a gift for the structural work, for reading how things fit together and where the weight would fall and how to make something that would stand. He was quieter than he had been before the winter and yet more present, which was a thing Elias stopped trying to explain and simply accepted. The boy spoke when he had something to say, and was silent when he didn't, and both states were entirely Owen. Wren stopped flinching at sudden sounds somewhere in the 2nd month in the valley. Elias noticed it first, the absence of the reflex rather than its presence, and he said nothing about it to anyone because some things heal better when you don't call attention to the healing. June drew everything: the mountains, the horses, the faces of the family at dinner, each portrait specific and recognizable, rendered with the instinct of someone who has found the language that fits her best. She covered the walls of her room with drawings and started on the hallway, and Nora drew the line at the kitchen but allowed the parlor. Holt grew 3 inches in 6 months and attributed this to Montana specifically, claiming the air was different here in a way that was better for growing, which no one could disprove and everyone found plausible. Cecily became Nora's primary partner in running the household, not because she was asked, but because she had opinions about how things should be organized and the organizational skill to back them up. She was also, Elias noticed, developing the habit of watching him work when she saw patients, which he took as information. He said nothing about it. He simply made sure she had a clear sightline when there was something worth seeing. 23 years is a long time to build something. It does not feel long when you are building it. It feels like seasons and harvests and early mornings and late nights, like arguments about small things and silences about large ones, like children becoming adults in the way that children do, gradually and then suddenly and then already. On a December morning in 1901, Elias sat in the rocking chair on the porch of the house he had built and looked at the valley below, which was white with the first real snow of the season and completely still in the way that wide-open places are still when the cold is serious. The house behind him was not still. 8 children and their families filled it to its comfortable limit, the sounds of them coming through the walls in a warm continuous register of voices and movement, and the chaos of grandchildren who have discovered that the upstairs hallway is an acceptable running track. Ada had come from Helena, where she had practiced medicine for 12 years, the first woman licensed to do so in the territory, and a fact she referenced with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted the outcome and been correct. Her husband Robert, who was a lawyer and found this entirely natural, had driven the sleigh himself through the pass despite everyone's advice about the weather. Owen was there with his wife and his 3 boys. Owen, who ran the most respected carpentry operation in the valley and who still spoke only as much as he needed to, and whose silence remained, as it always had been, entirely voluntary. Wren, who had learned to talk, and then learned to write, and then learned to write in a way that other people wanted to read, had arrived with a manuscript under her arm, and the expression of someone who was going to ask Elias to read it before he could establish any other priorities for the visit. Cecily ran the land operation with her husband, the 6,000 acres managed across its full extent now, cattle and timber and crops, a going concern that Daniel Voss had imagined and his daughter had built. She had also, 17 years after watching Elias work, obtained her own medical training and served the valley's families 2 days a week from a room in the main house that had been designated for the purpose. Holt was a deputy marshal and had been for 6 years and rode the territory circuit with the energy of a man who has found his exact right work and plans to continue it indefinitely. June's paintings hung in 2 galleries in Helena and 1 in San Francisco, and she claimed not to care about this and was very clearly lying. Hope, who was 22 years old and had grown up with medicine the way other children grow up with farming or carpentry, had left for medical school in Philadelphia in September and sent letters home that were detailed and enthusiastic and only occasionally alarming. Elias sat with all of this, not reviewing it as a list but simply holding the weight of it, the accumulated gravity of 23 years of living fully. The door opened behind him and a small person appeared at his side and leaned against the arm of the rocking chair with the comfortable possession of someone who has decided this proximity is available to them. His grandson, Robert, and Ada's youngest, 6 years old, with Ada's eyes and his father's diplomatic manner. "Grandpa," the boy said. Aunt Wren says you fought outlaws. Your Aunt Wren has a writer's relationship with proportion." The boy considered this. "She says you saved Grandma from bad men who were chasing her. Your grandmother had already saved herself by the time I arrived. I assisted. She says you adopted a whole family all at once. Something like that." The boy leaned further against the chair arm and looked at the valley with the serious attention of a child deciding how much credibility to extend adult understatement. "Grandpa," he said, "were you scared?" Elias looked at the valley, at the snow on the peaks he had looked at every morning for 23 years, at the tree line where Owen had taken his boys hunting last month, at the road coming up from Ridge Creek where Hope would come back along when she returned from Philadelphia, whenever that was. The door opened again and Nora came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the rocking chair arm and stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, looking at the valley with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything in his life, present and complete. He put his hand over hers. "Every single day," he said to his grandson. "Every day of the whole thing." The boy absorbed this with the gravity it deserved. "But you did it anyway," he said. "Yes, why?" Elias looked at Nora, who was looking at the snow. "Because some things," he said, "are worth being scared for." The boy nodded slowly, filing this in whatever place 6-year-olds file the information they intend to carry forward. Then he went back inside, letting in a brief wash of warmth and noise before the door swung shut again. Elias and Nora stood together on the porch in the cold morning, their coffee warm in their hands, the valley spread out below them in its winter silence. She leaned into him slightly, the way she had learned to over 23 years, finding the angle that fit. He put his arm around her. The snow came down, unhurried and indifferent, covering everything with the same clean patience it had always had. The same snow that had buried a ravine in Wyoming a long time ago, that had swallowed the sound of a child crying in the dark, that had been falling when a man on a gray horse had told himself he was not making a decision and made one anyway. It fell on the valley and the mountains and the house full of people who would not have been there without that one moment of turning back. He held his wife in the cold and watched it fall and did not feel the need to say anything else. There was nothing left to say that had not already been lived.